Hello and welcome to the Car Care Now channel. In today's video, we're going to take a look at a different era of Toyota, an era that is long gone and has produced some cars that are very interesting, like this one. This is a 1989 Toyota Cressida, and some of you might not even know what this car is and why it just disappeared. This was a luxury car before Lexus even existed. When Lexus came around, this car simply ceased to exist because it didn't make sense, because it was competing with its own newborn brother. In today's video, we're going to take a look at this car and you will see how Toyota used to do things completely different than how they do things 10 years ago and, of course, today, right after this. Let's take a tour around the 89 Cressida. We'll show you some things that were completely different in those times. First thing is, this car, at least to me, maybe I'm being a little biased because I have some memories with this car, it is actually holding up well, looks-wise. This is where less was more in those times. It was a very simple design. Of course, this is a US model, and my memories of it are not to the US model. This has the huge bumper. They loved to do that back in the day. For the US regulations, you had to have the huge bumper. Everywhere else in the world did not have the huge bumper. It actually looked better. But then you look at things that don't exist anymore. The glass headlights. These are not plastic, they're glass. And this is, I believe, this is plastic. You can hear that doesn't exist anymore. And then back in these times, Toyota did not have their big round logo. I think that came out right around 90, 91. So the cars had their own insignia. So this is the insignia for the Cressida. Every car had its own insignia. And very gently over here, they just write Toyota. Now you notice this grille it's been repainted, because this car actually has a story, which when we open the hood, look under the hood, we'll talk about it. But let's wrap around the side. See that insignia again on the wheels. These are actually the original wheels. Surprisingly, this car, these usually rusted really bad. This one is not bad at all, considering what it's been through. So let's look at the inside. And the first relic we see right off the bat is this. So this was a thing in that era of time in the US, where they wanted to push people to use seat belts, and they made this automatic seat belt. So basically, you sit down with this thing in your way, you put the key, turn it on. Actually, I think you have to close the door. There it is. Because I couldn't be bothered to just do this and clip it. That's how they did things. It was a completely different era. But then we look at the rest of the interior. Let me get out of the way so you guys can see it. So this material on the seats, by the way, is holding up extremely well. Considering, folks, this is a 34-year-old car. It is holding up super well. And this is not cloth. Correct me if I'm wrong. This could be wool or velour, one or the other. And then the other thing is, this car has 272,000 miles. It's not like it's some 50,000 mile garage queen. No, this car was driven and it still drives pretty well. But let me hop over on the other side and we'll talk about a few interesting things. And this is where the LS reference comes up. It surprises me that this feature still works. So if you look here, this is the kind of the HVAC controls. You can't really change some of the features here because they're hidden. But if you press this button, this whole thing comes out. Now you have buttons. If you are from this era, you know that this is the coolest thing in the planet, to have something come out and go in. And what's more surprising is it still works. That is the very interesting thing. And because this has these weird seat belts, which this one does not work, they had limit switches that go out all the time. We have these safety releases, and it starts beeping at you when you pull them, because this, in case of an accident, you want to release the seat belt, you use these. pretty interesting because the car starts beeping. Push down the belt release lever to remind you that you don't have your seatbelt bolted on. Now this does have an aftermarket radio, but look at this. Look at everything, the materials here on the roof. This is the old school stuff that holds up. You just don't see, now luxury cars will have material like this, not even. And look at this 34-year-old headliner. Not sagging, not really coming apart, just in great shape. Very interesting car from a very interesting era. But more interesting stuff, if you look right next to the dash, that is a speaker. I was, back in this time, if you wanted something very cool, you put a speaker in a very interesting spot. And then I haven't seen this in a very long time. The button to adjust the mirror is something you don't really, I don't remember the last Toyota that actually had that. That might be a one-off. And one-off things in cars like this is actually a problem because finding parts, if something goes wrong or breaks and you can't fix it, that becomes a problem. Steering wheel says Cressida on it. This was also another thing from the past. Now all newer cars will say the Toyota emblem on it. Back in those days, they used to say the name of the car. But let's look more in the trunk. And this is where we will find a lot of more interesting things. So, because this is basically a box, look at the shape of this trunk. It's been a minute. I haven't seen a car with a trunk shape like this. Usually they're curved, but this one is just a box. And of course, in the trunk we have the owner's specific relics. This is an original air filter for this car. And if you look at it in that era, they used to be round. This is very hard to find original. This is an actual original one. You can find them perhaps aftermarket, but finding an original one, yeah, you're gonna have a hard time. They do have a few more parts. Some of them are available, some of them are not. But what is not available is the repair manual. This is the actual repair manual for this car, folks. It has everything, because these cars didn't have a lot to them. You can find basically anything you want, and it's very, very well labeled because the owner is a DIY mechanic. And here's the addition of the electronic wiring diagram. I imagine that they stopped doing this with newer cars because this and this would be half the wiring diagram for modern cars because they just have a lot more stuff. But what's the interesting stuff? This material is such a nice carpet. I mean, newer cars, not even the inside carpet is this nice, and the trunk liner here is this nice material. But equally, if you look here, the spare tire is actually here. This was the time where things were done a little differently. Very interesting. This is actually a power antenna over here, but this one unfortunately is stuck up, doesn't move. They were very complicated, and this rolled into the 90s. The cable will go out, and then the motor will go out, and that was the whole thing. But we look at the back. It also says very small. Toyota and Cressida is bigger, because that's the more important part, not the Toyota part. Folks, this car brings a lot of memories for me, because where I come from, which in case you haven't watched that video, I originally come from Iraq. These were very popular, because in that time period, if you were someone that made it in life, you drove a Cressida. And that was, we actually had a super saloon. I think it was a Crown. That was another one, but this was the top. This was the top car of that time. It's holding up super well. I'm very surprised to see this in this condition with this smiles. Look at the back seat. It's also, I mean, the seats are holding up pretty well. Carpet's holding up very well. Very interesting. Well, let's take a look under the hood, because under the hood lives probably the one thing that made these not last, which is the engine. While this engine is a great engine, it did come with a little bit of a birth defect. This is the 7M GE. This is the same engine as the Mark III Supra. And it actually was shared with a lot of Soarer, non-domestic market, at least not the US model. We never had a Soarer at this time. But this is a great engine with one exception. that have head gasket problems, and repeated ones, one after one after one, kind of never ending head gasket problems. Some say because the torque was not proper. No, folks, the head gasket material was not good, because the following engine after this was the JZ series engines. They had a metal gasket. No problems at all. No matter what you do to this, unless you put a metal gasket, sooner or later, it's coming back. You have a head gasket leak. And this is the one thing that made these cars not last, because to my surprise, 10 years ago, you could find this engine everywhere. Anywhere. You go on eBay, you go to any importer of engines, you'll find hundreds just laying around waiting to be bought. Today, however, this engine is becoming kind of a relic, because most of them blew up, got swapped out for something better, or the cars in Japan that had this engine, they just ran out. And now finding this engine, should you have severe damage, is proving very difficult. So this is where this car has a small interesting story. And if you look here, I want you to kind of pay attention to this area, especially here, this hose right here, and this. And then let's look over here. Do you notice it looks like things have been glued? And initially that's what I thought. But actually, this car in 2009, we're into 2023, in case you're watching this in the future, this car in 2009 caught on fire right here. It had an aftermarket amp, and something was grounding, and it grounded the big wire for the amp, and the car caught on fire. It was a literal fire here. And in a result of that fire, some of these got charred like that. A lot of things got replaced, but it lives. Still here. And even to the owner's admittance, he was very shocked that this thing actually still is running, and he was able to bring it back and keep driving it. And the interesting story about this car is, this is the current owner, is the third owner. First owner, unknown. They bought it into the family at 80,000 miles. The father bought the car. Then the father gave it to the son as their first car. And that's when the fire issue happened. But now the son is older, and he cherishes this car because it was his first car that his dad handed him down to him. So he actually came all the way from Virginia to our shop to see if we can fix some of the issues that they have. And we're going to look at some of those issues. Some of them, unfortunately, we cannot fix simply because parts are not available, and it will take us months to locate some of these parts. So we're not going to be able to fix it in one sitting. But I'll share with you some of these issues that we're having. The first one is AC doesn't work. So we ran a systems check, and we found the leak. It's going to be a little hard to show you on camera, but if you look right here, so this is where things are extremely old school. If you look at this little, looks like a wire. It's actually an AC line right here. This is a mini AC line that goes inside the car to the evaporator. That is like the bulb that picks up the temperature. That got bent down, and it was rubbing on another line, and now it has a hole, and that's why we have no AC. Believe it or not, this AC compressor runs. Of course, this car has been converted from R12 to 134. We don't have R12, but that's one of the problems. And I told the owner flat out, we're gonna have a hard time doing this because you can't really weld that little line. It's such a little flimsy line. You can't really, by the time we weld it, it's just gone. And then you can't find one to buy, of course. So your only option is just scour the internet and see if somebody's selling one used. But even then, what guarantee that that little, very fragile little line is still intact? That is the one problem. And the other one is, in order to replace that, you might have to pull the dash. I actually would have to check into that, but let's one disaster at a time, if you would. We need to find the line first, then figure out what we have to take apart. And this glove just fell off because I did not ask why this glove is here, but it's here. We leave it exactly where it is. It must be there for a reason. This engine is very interesting to work on. There is a lot of vacuum hoses and things that are completely obsolete. Let's talk about a few things that are interesting in this engine. The first relic, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this is a relic. We have a distributor here. And this was actually a groundbreaking distributor for its time. And the other thing that is groundbreaking in this is actually fuel injection. When this engine first came out, it was something very modern, fuel injection. It had a cold start injector and all this good stuff. And then you look here at the early days of evaporative emission. This was the charcoal canister, which absolutely did not work. But that was, and then there is one more relic, this one. So this is a thermal vacuum switch. So basically, this is connected to the thermostat housing. When the temperature gets to a certain point, this allows vacuum through or does not allow it. So you can purge the canister. This was something actually extremely difficult to find at some point because these love to break. As soon as you touch them, they break. But I'm noticing lately, somebody's starting to reproduce them. Parts are the problem for this engine. I mean, finding certain specialty parts is proving very difficult, especially some of the hoses, some of the like AC lines, even aftermarket is not available. But let's do this. Let's put this car on the lift. Let's check out underneath it because there's so many interesting things underneath it and how Toyota used to do things that I think you guys will find it very interesting. Let's take a look underneath the Cressida. And the first thing is these turn signals with the bulb. This was a time where nobody was shy about exposed bolts. You'll never see that in a new car, that's for sure. But something about this car, this is probably a big surprise. 34-year-old car, it is driven in rust belt, and it's not really that rusty. And that goes to the owners, how they took care of it. Let's start looking at some of the interesting stuff. And the first one is the drain plug. It's actually a 24mm drain plug. This was something with the 7M. Most Toyotas were 14, even the old ones. This one was a 24 because 24 is better than 14. Now this car does have some oil leaks, and we're gonna talk about some of them, look at them together. But let's look at the suspension first. You will never see a car, probably past, I don't know, 95, that has suspension like this. You notice this shock connects directly to the bottom ball joint. This is technically not a McPherson design, but it somewhat is, because the bottom part of the shock, or actually the top part, is the knuckle itself, which is a very strange design. And you notice something interesting, this ball joint, this was the era before they were separate. This was actually part of the control arm, which was actually a single tiny little control arm. That's all it had. And then we have this little support piece right here, and that's it. Super simple suspension. This was not exactly a good handling car. I mean, even sports cars from this era did not handle very well compared to today. But single piston caliper in the front, and things are extremely basic in the front. Fortunately, these struts, if you look at them, they have a little bit of a leak. This one not so much, but the other side does have a little leak. You look at this side, you look at the very top, they do have a little bit of a leak. These are, of course, replacements. These are not the originals, but surprisingly though, I mean, we don't really have any play, and that's something this old. You expect things to wear out, but no, it's solid. But then we come around and we look here. This whole area is wet. This is the oil pan. It is leaking, and there's actually a line that I think it was a transmission line that somebody tried to fix unsuccessfully because it's still leaking. Fortunately, that line is not available, and you gotta kind of improvise when it comes to stuff like this. This was one of the things that the customer wanted to do. Hey, let's reseal the oil pan. Well, we're either lifting the engine or dropping the subframe. With cars like this, you do not want to disturb too much for a little oil leak like that, because anything that breaks turns into a giant project. And if we don't have a leak that is really heavy, especially with a car that sits, you'd want to think about it twice before going and tearing into this car with no parts available. If something breaks, now you're improvising, and for something that is such a small thing, it's not worth it. But what is important here, and this is one of the concerns that we are going to fix on this car, you look at this bushing for the rack. So again, this is another throwback. This bushing is completely gone. So what happens with this car is, and this is one of the important concerns that he came for, so you drive it straight, you make a somewhat of a sharp turn, all of a sudden the steering wheel is now not centered anymore, because this rack is moving. Every time you put force on it, it moves, because these are the two bushings that hold it. This was actually not a good design, if you ask me, because you're relying the whole geometry of the steering on these two little bushings. They still use the similar design up to mid-2000s, some of the trucks, but they usually will have a stationary bushing and then one of these bushings. So if it does go out, you'll have a little bit of movement, but nothing excessive like this. And this one is a little scary to drive, because steering wheel just, it's turned this way when you start driving it straight, and all of a sudden you make a turn, it's now turned this way because the whole rack is moving and changing the alignment. And then we look at the rack itself. This has definitely been replaced, and you notice here it says Toyota. This is something Toyota. By the way, the creators of Toyota were actually Toyota. That was their original last name. They changed the T because they felt like foreigners will have an easier time saying Toyota than Toyota. That's just their thinking. We have a lot of little leaks here, and mainly from the lines, just seeping. Nothing excessive though. For considering the age of this car, it's actually not bad. The transmission has been replaced, or actually rebuilt, replaced and rebuilt. So this does have a very harsh shift, and it's having an issue with downshifting, and that has to do with the cable. We need to adjust it. This was the time where, yes, this was electronically controlled, but the downshifts, because it has, you know, regular cable throttle, you had a cable that goes here, and that's what does the kick down, so you downshift and accelerate. But one concern we are fixing, they have vibration from the driveline. Every time you drive it, it just vibrates. They did have the center support bearing, which is super common on these, replaced. This drive shaft was actually taken to a drive shaft shop, and it was balanced, so it's not a drive shaft issue. But if you notice here, this mount is completely collapsed. This is supposed to be all the way up, and it's all the way down, therefore changing the angle of the drive line, and that's why we have vibration. This mount was surprisingly still available. Original and aftermarket is pretty available. You notice here we have a few seepages. This is the, again another relic you never see in newer cars. This is the speedo cable. You know, this went into the late 90s, then it was gone. But that is how the speedometer actually works. This cable runs all the way to the speedometer, and that's how it works. But it's still a surprise. Look how clean this body is. It doesn't have holes. Doesn't, you know, it's not completely rotten. Really, the only rot we have is over here, and it's not structural. It's actually just the fender. This piece you see right here that is rusted, this is the fender, because the structural piece is here, and that is solid. Same thing on this side. You notice the fender bottom is rotted. You can see it moving, but the structure itself, it's solid. Very surprising. Same thing with the brake lines. These brake lines were not coated from the factory, and surprisingly they make this interesting turn to the side. Don't know why they did that, but they did. Exhaust, of course, been replaced multiple times. This is not the original exhaust. Understandably so, that's the part that always goes in these cars. Then we look at the rear suspension, and things are extremely basic. You have a multi-link. This perhaps is a design that carried over, but the rest, this is stuff you'll not see in other Toyotas. And the surprise is, this is disc brake in the back. That was something groundbreaking at the time. A lot of cars have drum brakes in the back. That was the norm. This had disc brake in the back. Although a very clunky caliper that loves to lock up, that was one of their things. But sway bar that is tiny. Look at this tiny little sway bar. And that's why these were not good handling cars. They weaved and kind of sway all over the place. Huge rear differential. And it is something said about the Cressida, the reason the rear seat's so tiny, and they are a little small, it's because they were rear-wheel drive. They had to make space for this giant differential. Folks, this is an enormous differential. You will see the new LS with a V8 will have this big of a differential, and this thing has this giant differential with huge axles. I don't know, this thing probably makes around 190 horsepower, somewhere around there when it was new. And look at this beefy big axle, which is not leaking, all original, nothing really wrong with it. Very interesting car from a very interesting era of Toyota. See, these were the times where Toyota was not a big company. They were trying to make the push, but they were still not a big car company. So some of their designs here, it almost didn't make sense, or you feel like they were budget. It almost like you look at the smaller companies from today, they'll have designs like this, but you look at old Toyotas, they had designs where things were not uniform. They didn't have uniformity between their cars and other models, and this was a perfect example of that. What a beautiful preserved car though. And this is the fuel tank. This was before safety regulations, by the way. This is a metal fuel tank. In case you didn't know, metal fuel tanks are actually not a good idea. They rust, and composite or plastic, for lack of a better word, is better. Some people don't like that, but it's actually better. And very close to a rear end accident. That was the thing. So they started moving the fuel tanks more toward the front. Probably easier with a front wheel drive configuration because you don't have all this real estate, but that was Toyota from a different era. So this is the Toyota Cressida. Folks, if you own one of these, you will have a lot of difficulties keeping it on the road. From the head gasket issues with the engine, from little things like that AC line, parts are a problem. And this was a conversation with the owner of this car. Every time you have a car that is over 30 years old, parts become a huge issue. You need a radiator? Easy. You need a part that is shared with a lot of other models? Sure. But Toyota in this era did not have a lot of parts sharing, and their designs were completely different than what it is today. So parts remain a problem for cars like this. That air filter that I showed you, it's very hard to find. If you own a car like this, you need to always be in the hunt for parts, especially original parts. I mean, finding struts for this original, extremely difficult, if not flat out impossible. And this is one of the problems we're having with it. As a shop owner, I like to help people as much as possible, but when it comes to cars like this, it is really dependent on the parts availability, unfortunately, because certain things we can fix, but an AC line that has rubbed off and is leaking, you cannot really do much about that. And we're not about to keep this car for 6 months experimenting with it. We don't do that. And that is unfortunately the normal thing with automotive industry today, because sometimes things just get too old. And this car, unfortunately, does not have the following of cars like the Supra or the MR2, the older ones, that some companies will still produce parts for them. This is not one of those, but this is a very important car for Toyota because this is kind of the initial Lexus. Then Lexus came about and everything is history and you know it. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you. And you have yourself a wonderful day.